He was one of the greatest fighter pilots the world had ever seen. A man who flew over 300 combat missions, shot down 104 enemy aircraft, and wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds around his neck as a living symbol of everything the Luftwaffe was supposed to represent. Adolf Galland was charismatic, fearless, razor-sharp in the cockpit, and utterly devoted to the men who served under him. Hermann Göring, on the other hand, was the bloated, vain, and increasingly delusional commander of the German Air Force, a man who had once been a celebrated ace himself, but had long since traded the cockpit for a life of grotesque luxury and political maneuvering at Hitler's side. Between these two men, a war within a war would unfold, one marked by humiliation, betrayal, bureaucratic cruelty, and a final act of defiance so audacious that it has no real parallel in the history of any air force on any side of the Second World War. In this video, we will find out exactly how Adolf Galland, Germany's most celebrated fighter pilot, became the personal enemy of the man who commanded the entire German Air Force. We will follow him from the fields of Westphalia, where he was born, through the skies of Spain and Poland and France and England, into the smoke-filled rooms of the Reich Air Ministry, where careers were made and destroyed, and finally into the cockpit of the most revolutionary jet aircraft of the entire war, leading a squadron of hand-picked aces against overwhelming odds in the dying weeks of the Third Reich. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. Adolf Joseph Ferdinand Galland was born on March 19, 1912, in Westerholt, a small town in the Westphalia region of Western Germany. He was the second of 4 brothers born into a middle-class Catholic family, and from his earliest childhood he displayed an insatiable hunger for speed and the sky. His father, Adolf Galland Sr., worked as an estate manager, and the family was not wealthy, but they were respectable and hard-working. And young Adolf grew up in a household where discipline and ambition were quietly encouraged. The defining moment of his childhood, by his own later account, came in 1917 when he was just 5 years old. A German military aircraft made an emergency landing in the fields near his home, and the young boy ran across the meadows to see it up close. He pressed his face against the machine's fuselage, stared at the cockpit, and felt something shift inside him permanently. He had found his calling, and he would spend the rest of his life pursuing it with a single-mindedness that impressed everyone who knew him and occasionally frightened them as well. By the time Galland was a teenager, the seeds of what would become his obsession had already taken deep root. Germany in the 1920s was a nation humiliated and restrained by the Treaty of Versailles, which had stripped the country of its air force and placed strict limitations on military rearmament. But the Germans, being the Germans, found ways around these restrictions, and one of the most brilliant was the promotion of gliding as a civilian sport. The great soaring cliffs and updrafts of the Rhone Mountains became a training ground for a generation of German aviators who could claim to be nothing more than enthusiastic hobbyists while actually mastering the fundamentals of flight. Galland threw himself into this world with complete devotion. He joined a gliding club at the age of 15, and within a year he was already one of the most skilled young pilots in his region, displaying a natural, intuitive understanding of air currents and aircraft behavior that his instructors found remarkable. He had a gift, the kind that cannot be taught, and he knew it, though he was careful not to let that knowledge make him careless. In 1932, at the age of 20, Galland applied to join the newly forming Lufthansa German Airlines as a trainee pilot, and was accepted. This was a deliberate and clever arrangement by the German military establishment, which was already secretly preparing to rebuild a forbidden air force under the cover of civilian aviation. Galland and hundreds of other young men like him received thorough flight training under the guise of commercial pilot preparation, learning formation, flying, navigation, instrument approaches, and the handling of increasingly powerful aircraft. He proved so capable that he was selected for advanced fighter pilot training. And in 1934, as Adolf Hitler was consolidating power over Germany and the Nazi regime was beginning its rapid and terrifying expansion, Galland was formally inducted into the secret German military air arm that would, the following year, reveal itself to the world as the Luftwaffe. The newly unveiled Luftwaffe was Göring's prize and his personal empire. Hermann Wilhelm Göring had been one of the genuine heroes of the First World War, a pilot who had scored 22 aerial victories, commanded the legendary Richthofen Squadron after the death of Manfred von Richthofen himself, and won the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honour. But the years after that war had not been kind to Göring's character. He had become addicted to morphine following a wound received during the beer hall putsch of 1923, had grown enormously fat, had developed a taste for theatrical costumes and jeweled decorations that bordered on the fantastical, and had attached himself permanently to Hitler's rising star, serving as a key political operative for the Nazi Party. By 1935, Göring was not just the commander of the Luftwaffe, but one of the most powerful men in Germany, second perhaps only to Hitler himself, and he ran his air force with a combination of genuine aviation knowledge, enormous personal vanity, and a growing detachment from operational military reality that would have catastrophic consequences as the war progressed. Galland, meanwhile, was doing what he did best. He was flying. In 1937, with war clouds gathering over Europe and Spain already torn by civil conflict, Germany made the decision to intervene on the side of Francisco Franco's nationalist forces, partly for ideological reasons and partly because the Spanish Civil War offered the Luftwaffe an extraordinary opportunity to test its aircraft, its tactics, and its pilots under real combat conditions. The German contribution to Franco's war effort was organised as the Condor Legion, an expeditionary force of aircraft, pilots and ground crews that would prove to be one of the most formative military units of the 20th century. Among the men sent to Spain was Adolf Galland, and the experience would shape him in ways that stayed with him for the rest of his life. When Galland arrived in Spain in May 1937, he was assigned not to the fighter force, as he desperately wanted, but to a close air support role flying the Heinkel, a 51 biplane in direct support of Franco's ground troops. He hated it. The A-51 was an obsolete machine in 1937, inferior in almost every respect to the Soviet aircraft that the Republican forces were flying, and the close support mission felt to Galland like a waste of his skills. But he performed the role with his characteristic professionalism, flying a staggering 300 missions in Spain and earning his first experience of what it meant to operate aircraft in a shooting war. He learned things in Spain that no training manual could teach him. He learned that pilots get tired in ways that affect their judgment before they even notice it. He learned that ground coordination is far more difficult in practice than in theory. He learned that aircraft break down at the worst possible moments. And he learned, above all, that the personal relationship between a pilot and his aircraft, the intimate understanding of its strengths and limitations, was the single most important factor in aerial survival. He carried every one of these lessons into the battles that were coming. He also came away from Spain with a burning frustration. The great aerial battles of the Civil War were being fought by pilots in sleek new monoplane fighters, the Soviet Polikarpov Down-16 on the Republican side, and the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 on the nationalist side, and Galland had been stuck in a biplane doing supply escort work for Franco's infantry. He had applied repeatedly for a transfer to the fighter units, and had been repeatedly denied. When he finally returned to Germany in 1938, he had an impressive record of service but almost no actual air-to-air combat experience. He was determined to change that as quickly as possible. Back in Germany, Galland joined the newly forming fighter units of the Luftwaffe proper and finally got his hands on the Bf-109, the aircraft that would define the first phase of his combat career. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was, in 1938, one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world. It was fast, it was agile at altitude, it had excellent firepower, and it had been designed by a genius named Willy Messerschmitt, with a ruthless focus on performance at the expense of almost everything else, including pilot comfort and ease of handling. The cockpit was cramped and claustrophobic, the landing gear was narrow and treacherous on rough airfields, and the aircraft had some genuinely vicious habits at low speeds, but in the hands of a skilled and experienced pilot, it was a devastatingly effective weapon. Galland took to it immediately. He had a gift for the machine, an ability to extract the maximum from its capabilities while staying well inside its limitations, and within months of joining his new unit, he was being identified as one of the most talented young fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and the Second World War began, Galland was not initially part of the fighting. He had been given command of a ground attack unit, much to his disappointment, and spent the Polish campaign supporting army operations rather than engaging in the kind of fighter combat he craved. The Polish Air Force fought bravely, but was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the German assault, and the campaign was over in less than 6 weeks, with Poland crushed between the German advance from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east. Galland watched the victory celebrations with a mixture of pride in German arms and private frustration at his own situation. He was 27 years old, superbly trained, and sitting in ground attack aircraft while the aerial war he had prepared his whole life for was being fought by other men. He lobbied his superiors constantly, formally and informally, for a transfer to the fighter arm, and his persistence finally paid off in 1940. By the time Germany launched its stunning offensive against France in the Low Countries on May 10th of that year, Adolf Galland was in a Bf-109 flying as part of JG-27, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, and everything in his world had changed. The Battle of France, as it would later be called, lasted only 6 weeks from start to finish, and in that extraordinarily brief time it overturned the entire European order that had been established at Versailles in 1919. The German army, supported by the Luftwaffe, smashed through the Ardennes forest in a move that the Allied High Command had considered impossible, cut off the British Expeditionary Force and the best French divisions in Belgium, and drove to the English Channel with a speed that left the entire world stunned. In the skies over France, Galland flew with a ferocity and precision that quickly brought him to the attention of his commanders. He shot down his first enemy aircraft, a French Morane-Saulnier MS-406, on May 12, 1940, just 2 days into the Western Campaign. Over the following weeks he added victory after victory, flying multiple missions each day, pushing himself and his aircraft to their absolute limits and developing the tactical instincts that would later make him famous. By the time France surrendered on June 22, 1940, Galland had accumulated 17 confirmed aerial victories and had won the Iron Cross First and Second Class. He had also lost friends, watched men he knew and trained with burn in their cockpits or spiral into the earth, and learned in the most direct possible way what aerial combat cost the men who practiced it. None of this made him cautious. If anything, it made him hungrier. The fall of France left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, and in the summer of 1940, Hermann Göring turned to Hitler with what seemed like a straightforward proposition. "Give him the Luftwaffe," Göring said, and he would bomb Britain into submission or at least soften it up enough that a German invasion could succeed. Hitler agreed, and the Battle of Britain began. It would prove to be the most important air campaign of the entire war, and it would also be the moment when the cracks in Göring's leadership first became visible to the men who served under him, and no one would see those cracks more clearly or document them more painfully than Adolf Galland. The Battle of Britain opened in earnest in July 1940, and Galland, now commanding a Gruppe, one of the operational units of a fighter wing, threw himself into it with everything he had. The opposing force, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, was smaller than the Luftwaffe, but was fighting over its own territory, possessed excellent radar warning capability through the chain home network, and was led with extraordinary intelligence and economy by Dowding and his sector controllers, who could direct their fighters with a precision the Luftwaffe found baffling and infuriating. The Bf-109s were better aircraft in many respects than the Hawker Hurricanes that made up the majority of Fighter Command's strength, but they were closely matched by the Supermarine Spitfire, and the German pilots had a crippling limitation that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Flying from their bases in northern France, the Bf-109s had enough fuel to operate over southern England for only about 20 to 30 minutes before they had to turn for home or run the risk of ditching in the Channel. This meant that the bombers they were supposed to escort were largely on their own over their targets, and the battle quickly settled into a grinding war of attrition that was bleeding the Luftwaffe's fighter force white. Throughout the summer of 1940, Galland's kill count climbed steadily and spectacularly. On August 1st, Göring presented him with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military award at that point, in a ceremony that generated enormous propaganda coverage. Galland was already becoming famous in Germany, his face appearing on magazine covers, his exploits celebrated in radio broadcasts, and he handled the fame with a kind of relaxed, almost amused confidence that made him even more popular. He enjoyed good food and drink and cigars, genuinely massive cigars that he smoked in the cockpit when the situation allowed, and he had a talent for enjoying life that many of his more anxious contemporaries envied, and that his superiors occasionally found slightly impertinent. But behind the public image, Galland was deeply worried. He could see with absolute clarity what Göring apparently could not, which was that the Battle of Britain was not going well for Germany. Fighter Command was battered, but not broken. The Bf-109 pilots were exhausted, flying mission after mission at the extreme edge of their aircraft's range, watching their fuel gauges with a terror that had nothing to do with the enemy in front of them and everything to do with the mathematics of distance and consumption. Men were being lost, not just to British fighters, but to fuel exhaustion, engine failure, and the simple accumulated wear of too many missions in too short a time. The bombers were suffering terrible losses when the fighter escort had to turn back, and the Luftwaffe's intelligence staff consistently underestimated the size and resilience of the RAF's fighter reserve, confidently declaring every week or so that fighter command was on the brink of collapse when in fact it was nothing of the kind. Then came the meeting that would define the rest of Galland's career and his relationship with Göring for the remainder of the war. In late August 1940, Göring summoned his fighter commanders to Carinhall, his enormous and fantastically decorated country estate north of Berlin, for a conference. Göring was in one of his most overbearing moods, convinced that the Battle of Britain was nearly won if only his fighter pilots would fly more aggressively and stop making excuses about fuel and range. He lectured the assembled commanders, criticising their tactics, accusing them of timidity, and demanding results. Then he turned to Galland and Werner Mölders, the two most decorated and celebrated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, and asked them what they needed to finish the job. What, Göring demanded, could he give them that would make the decisive difference? Werner Mölders answered carefully and diplomatically, asking for more powerful engines and improved ammunition. Then Göring turned to Galland, and Adolf Galland, who had never been particularly interested in diplomacy when honesty would serve better, looked the commander of the German Air Force in the eye and told him, in front of everyone assembled, exactly what he needed to win the Battle of Britain. He needed, Galland said, a squadron of Spitfires. The silence that followed this statement was probably the loudest silence anyone in that room had ever experienced. Göring's face went through several colours. For a Luftwaffe pilot to stand in front of the Reich Marshal and declare that what he needed was the enemy's aircraft rather than anything Germany made was not merely an insult, it was practically a declaration of incompetence on the part of the entire German aircraft industry, and by extension on the part of the man who commanded and championed it. Göring was furious. According to multiple accounts of the incident, he turned red, then purple, and struggled visibly to contain himself before dismissing the meeting in a rage. He never forgave Galland for those words. The remark about the Spitfires became famous throughout the Luftwaffe, and eventually throughout the Allied High Command as well when it was reported after the war, and it perfectly encapsulated the fundamental difference between the two men. Göring dealt in politics and prestige, and the management of Hitler's expectations. Galland dealt in reality, in the cold mathematics of combat, in what actually happened when aircraft met in the sky at 400 miles per hour with men's lives depending on every variable. These two approaches to the air war were incompatible, and the conflict between them would only deepen as the war went on. Despite this catastrophic meeting, Galland's personal performance in the Battle of Britain remained extraordinary. By September 1940, his kill count had passed 40, and on September 25th, he scored his 40th confirmed victory, which entitled him under Luftwaffe regulations to the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, making him one of the first men in the entire German armed forces to receive that upgrade. The ceremony was conducted by Hitler personally at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, and Galland found himself the subject of yet another wave of public celebration. He was 28 years old and one of the most famous men in Germany, photographed alongside Goring and Hitler, praised in every newspaper, held up as the living embodiment of Luftwaffe excellence. And he was exhausted, privately furious about the strategic direction of the air campaign and increasingly convinced that the senior leadership of the German Air Force simply did not understand the war they were fighting. The Battle of Britain ended in October 1940 without the decisive German victory Göring had promised. Fighter command had not been destroyed. The Royal Air Force continued to exist and to fight. The planned German invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was indefinitely postponed and would never happen. Göring, unwilling to accept responsibility for this failure, cast about for explanations that did not involve his own leadership, and found it convenient to blame his fighter pilots for not being aggressive enough, for not protecting the bombers adequately, for not doing the things he had ordered them to do, regardless of whether those things were physically possible, given the range constraints of their aircraft. The fighter commanders, Galland prominent among them, pointed out repeatedly and with increasing anger that they had been ordered to fly close. escort missions that negated the greatest advantage their aircraft possessed, which was the freedom to maneuver freely and use their superior speed aggressively. Tied to the bombers, the Bf-109s could neither pursue damaged enemy aircraft nor evade attacking Spitfires with full effectiveness. The arguments fell on deaf ears. Göring needed someone to blame, and blaming his fighter pilots was easier than examining his own decisions. In November 1940, an event occurred that changed Galland's career dramatically and set him on a collision course with Göring that would eventually threaten his life. Werner Mulders, who had been slightly ahead of Galland in the race for aerial victories throughout the summer, and who had been one of the few pilots Galland genuinely considered a peer in terms of tactical skill, was killed in a completely non-combat accident. He was a passenger in a Heinkel He-111 bomber that crashed in poor weather near Breslau in November 1941 on his way to attend the funeral of Ernst Udet, another legendary aviator who had recently committed suicide under the pressure of his impossible job as head of Luftwaffe aircraft procurement. Galland was devastated by Mulder's death. The two men had been rivals in the best sense of the word, pushing each other to higher standards while maintaining a genuine mutual respect, and Mulders had served as a kind of moderating influence that helped offset Galland's more confrontational tendencies. Without him, Galland stood alone as the preeminent figure in the German fighter force, and this visibility, combined with his habit of speaking truth to power, would make him a much more prominent target for Göring's anger. The year 1941 brought massive changes to the shape of the war. In June, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, and the Luftwaffe found itself committed to an entirely new and even more demanding theatre of operations. Galland, however, spent most of 1941 in the West, flying from France, now commanding JG-26, the Abbeville Boys, as they were known to the British due to their base at Abbeville in northern France, one of the most formidable fighter units in any air force in the world. JG-26 flew almost continuous operations over the English Channel and southern England, engaging the increasingly confident Royal Air Force in a series of battles that were smaller in scale than the great clashes of 1940, but no less deadly for the men involved. Galland added steadily to his kill count, while simultaneously managing the enormous administrative and leadership responsibilities that came with commanding a full wing of several hundred men. He was a natural leader in the fundamental sense, able to inspire intense loyalty without demanding it, leading by example rather than authority, and known throughout the Luftwaffe as a commander who fought for his pilots' interests and welfare with the same ferocity he brought to aerial combat. His kill count reached 100 confirmed victories by June 1941, an extraordinary milestone that only a handful of pilots on any side would ever achieve, and this earned him the Swords to the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, a decoration that only 12 men had received at that point in the war. Hitler personally presented it to him, and the propaganda machine once again went to work celebrating Germany's most decorated and glamorous aviator. Galland handled all of it with his characteristic mixture of genuine pride and quiet irreverence. He accepted the awards and the attention because refusing them would have been pointless, but he was always more interested in the next mission than in the previous decoration, and the men who served under him loved him partly for this, for the sense that their commander was always thinking about how to fight better rather than how to look better. In December 1941, the war changed its shape yet again in ways that would eventually prove fatal to Germany. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th brought the United States into the conflict on the Allied side, and while the full weight of American industrial power and military manpower would not make itself felt for another year or more, every senior German officer who understood the arithmetic of national strength knew that this was catastrophic news. The combined productive capacity of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire vastly exceeded anything Germany and its allies could put into the field, and the only scenario in which Germany could win was one in which the war ended quickly enough that this disparity never fully materialized. That scenario was becoming less and less plausible with every passing month. Galland understood this, though there was not much he could do about it from his fighter wing in northern France. What he could do, and did with considerable energy, was think about the future of aerial warfare and what the Luftwaffe needed to survive. By late 1941 and into 1942, it was becoming clear to Galland and to every thoughtful observer of the air war that the Bf-109, extraordinary as it was reaching the limits of its development potential. The British were fielding improved marks of the Spitfire constantly, each version faster and better armed than the last, and the Americans were bringing their own fighters into the theatre, the P-38 Lightning and eventually the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, aircraft that represented the absolute cutting edge of piston engine fighter design. The Germans were answering with the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a superb aircraft that when it appeared in 1941 was actually superior to the Spitfire. Mark V it encountered and caused considerable alarm in fighter command, but the fundamental technological competition between the Allies and Germany was tilting steadily in the Allied direction, driven by the enormous research and manufacturing resources available to the Anglo-American Partnership. Galland began pressing his superiors for faster development of Germany's next-generation aircraft, for a serious commitment to the jet engine research that German scientists had been quietly pursuing, for the kind of forward thinking that the immediate demands of current operations made it easy to avoid. His voices joined a growing chorus, but whether anyone in authority was actually listening was another question entirely. In November 1941, in the aftermath of yet another disagreeable conference with Göring, Galland received news that would once again transform his position. He was promoted, not to a higher command within the fighter arm as he might have expected, but to the top job itself. He was appointed General of the Fighter Arm, the Jagdflieger Inspector, the officer responsible for fighter operations, tactics, training and development for the entire Luftwaffe. He was 29 years old. He was, at the time of his appointment, the youngest general in the German armed forces and possibly the youngest general holding an equivalent position in any major air force in history. The appointment was made partly because of his extraordinary combat record, partly because of his obvious tactical intelligence, and partly because Hitler had personally taken an interest in the charismatic and photogenic young ace and wanted him in a prominent position. Göring had approved the appointment, though not without some private reservations about having a subordinate who had already publicly asked for Spitfires and who was known to be less than reverential in his dealings with authority. The job that Galland inherited was a poisoned chalice of remarkable sophistication. As general of the fighter arm, he had enormous influence on paper and surprisingly little real power. He could make recommendations about tactics, aircraft, training standards and operational doctrine, but the final authority for almost everything of consequence lay with Göring, and Göring's decisions were influenced by Hitler's preferences, by his own vanity and wishful thinking, and by the political pressures of running one of the largest military establishments in German history. Galland immediately began making recommendations, most of which were ignored. He argued for concentrated fighter forces instead of dispersed ones. He argued for a training pipeline that prioritized quality over quantity. He argued for strategic thinking about air defense rather than the reflexive deployment of fighters in response to immediate crises. He argued, above all, for treating his pilots as the skilled professionals they were, rather than as instruments to be expended in pursuit of whatever tactical goal seemed most pressing at any given moment. Goring listened to these arguments with varying degrees of impatience and dismissed most of them. The two men's relationship, never warm after the Spitfire incident, deteriorated steadily through 1942 and into 1943 as the war turned increasingly against Germany on every front. Stalingrad fell in February 1943, the catastrophic defeat of the German Sixth Army marking the clear turning point on the Eastern Front. The North Africa campaign was collapsing, soon to end in the surrender of 250,000 Axis soldiers. And over Germany itself, a new and terrible threat was developing in the skies, one that would test the Luftwaffe's fighter force to its absolute limits and would eventually bring Galland into the most serious conflict of his career. The American threat that began to materialize over Germany in 1942 and grew to overwhelming proportions through 1943 and 1944 was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine of daylight strategic bombing, the idea that heavily armed four-engine bombers flying in tight defensive formations could penetrate deep into German territory, destroy the industrial infrastructure that sustained the Wehrmacht, and break Germany's capacity and will to fight without the need for a ground invasion. The aircraft chosen for this mission were the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, massive machines bristling with heavy machine guns, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads and built to fly at altitudes that were supposed to make them difficult targets. The theory was that a formation of these aircraft with hundreds of guns providing mutual defensive cover could fight its way to and from any target in Germany without needing fighter escort. The theory was wrong. Galland knew it was wrong before the first major American raid crossed the German border. He had watched the Luftwaffe's own bombers suffer catastrophic losses over Britain in 1940 when they flew beyond their fighter escort's range, and the physics of the situation were identical regardless of which air force was involved. Bombers without fighter escort are vulnerable to fighter attack, period. End of discussion. He began immediately preparing his fighter units to exploit this vulnerability, studying the American formations, developing interception tactics, and lobbying for the concentration of defensive fighter forces over Germany, rather than their dispersal across every theatre where the Luftwaffe was also fighting. But here was where Galland ran into the first of many walls that would define his tenure as general of the fighter arm. Göring had committed the Luftwaffe to an offensive doctrine. The idea that German fighters should be concentrated for defensive purposes over the Reich felt to Göring like defeatism, an admission that Germany could not dominate its opponents in their own skies. He resisted the reallocation of fighter forces. He continued to send fighters to support operations in the Mediterranean, in the East, in Norway, in North Africa, thinning the defensive screen over Germany at exactly the moment when it needed to be thickest. And when American raids began producing alarming loss figures among the bombers, Göring's response was not to acknowledge the accuracy of Galland's predictions, but to demand that the fighter pilots try harder, fly more missions, engage more aggressively, as though additional courage would somehow substitute for the strategic concentration Galland was asking for. The American raids of 1943 did initially produce terrible losses, not just for the Luftwaffe, but for the Americans themselves. The raids on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories in August and October 1943 are the most famous examples, particularly the second raid on October 14th, which would become known as Black Thursday. On that day, a force of 291 B-17S penetrated deep into Germany without fighter escort and was set upon by wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to their English bases, 60 of them had been shot down, with 594 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Another 17 bombers were so badly damaged they never flew again. The mission loss rate of nearly 21% was catastrophically unsustainable. If the Americans continued at that rate, they would run out of experienced crews and aircraft within weeks. For a brief moment in the autumn of 1943, it seemed as though the German fighter force might actually be able to defeat the American strategic bombing campaign. Galland watched these battles with a professional soldier's analytical eye and understood both what they proved and what they obscured. Yes, the Luftwaffe had inflicted enormous damage on American forces when they flew without escort. But the Americans were learning, adapting, and above all, building. The industrial output of the United States was generating new aircraft, new crews, and new technology at a rate that Germany could not begin to match, and the Americans were already working on a solution to the escort problem that would change everything once again. Galland could see this coming, even if Göring could not or would not. He pushed relentlessly for Germany to accelerate the development of advanced technology, particularly the jet engine, which represented the only genuine qualitative leap that Germany could make. The Germans had a head start in jet aviation that was remarkable by any standard of measurement. Engineers like Hans-Joachim Pabst von Ohain had developed the first operational jet aircraft before the war began. And by 1942, the Messerschmitt May 262 was already flying as a prototype. Here, Galland believed, was Germany's answer to the Allied numerical advantage, a jet fighter that was so fast, so fundamentally superior to anything powered by a piston engine, that it could sweep the American bombers from the sky despite the enormous numbers being thrown against Germany. But getting from the prototype to the production line would require decisions that were not Galland's to make. The year 1943 also brought Galland a series of personal encounters with the realities of what his pilots were enduring that added emotional weight to his already strong professional arguments. He flew combat missions himself whenever his administrative duties permitted, partly because flying was simply who he was and he could not stay out of the cockpit, and partly because he believed that a commander who no longer flew could not truly lead flying men. He was shot down twice during the war, on both occasions managing to survive, and he flew enough missions to understand the cumulative physical and psychological toll that prolonged combat flying imposed on even the most resilient men. The pilots of the Jagdwaffe, the German fighter arm, were by 1943 being asked to fly day after day with almost no rest in aircraft that were increasingly matched or outclassed by their opponents against an enemy that was growing stronger rather than weaker. The losses were appalling, not just in absolute numbers, but in the irreplaceable quality of what was being lost. Every experienced pilot who died or was captured and spent months in captivity recovering from wounds represented years of training and irreplaceable operational wisdom that could not be quickly replaced from the training pipeline. Galland fought constantly to improve the training situation, arguing that it was better to produce fewer pilots who were genuinely ready for combat than to churn out large numbers of men who were killed in their first few missions because they lacked the skills to survive. Göring disagreed. Under pressure from Hitler for results, he demanded more aircraft and more pilots in the shortest possible time, and the training standards that had made the Luftwaffe's pre-war pilots the best in the world were progressively eroded to meet the production quotas. New pilots arrived at their units in 1943 with perhaps a quarter of the flying hours that their predecessors had accumulated before joining operational squadrons, and they died at a corresponding rate, consuming resources and delivering very little combat effectiveness in return before their short careers ended. Galland watched this happen with a sense of mounting despair that he expressed in report after report, meeting after meeting, argument after argument with Göring and with the Air Ministry staff. Nothing changed. His relationship with Goring was now openly antagonistic. They disagreed about tactics, about training, about the allocation of resources, about the strategic direction of the air war, about almost every significant question that came before them. Goring dealt with disagreement by alternating between volcanic rage and icy contempt, occasionally threatening subordinates with court-martial or worse when they displeased him, retreating to Carinal for days at a time when the news from the fronts was particularly bad, and managing his relationship with Hitler through a combination of flattery, concealment, and increasingly fantastic promises that no air force on earth could have delivered. Galland dealt with disagreement by continuing to argue, by documenting his positions in formal memoranda that created an awkward written record of every failure of Luftwaffe leadership, and by building coalitions among the other senior fighter commanders who shared his views. This was exactly the kind of behaviour that made Göring furious because it suggested that the problems in the fighter arm were not the result of inadequate courage or insufficient aggressiveness on the part of the pilots, but of decisions made at the command level, decisions that were ultimately Göring's decisions and that reflected poorly on his judgment and leadership. By the beginning of 1944, the situation had taken a turn that vindicated everything Galland had been arguing for the previous 2 years and simultaneously made it worse. The Americans had introduced the North American P-51 Mustang into the European theatre as a long-range escort fighter, fitting it, with drop tanks that allowed it to accompany the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51 was an extraordinary aircraft, fast, manoeuvrable, and with a range that made it qualitatively different from any other fighter on any side. Suddenly, the American bombers were not alone over Germany. They were accompanied deep into German territory by hundreds of Mustangs flown by pilots who were well-trained, well-equipped, and fighting with the growing confidence that comes from knowing the war is going your way. The brief window in which the Luftwaffe's fighter force had been able to exact catastrophic tolls from the unescorted American formations was closed. The Big Week Air Campaign of February 1944, a series of massive coordinated attacks by the American 8th and 15th Air Forces against German aircraft factories, demonstrated with brutal clarity that the defensive situation had fundamentally changed. German fighter losses during that week were devastating, and the attrition continued relentlessly as the tempo of American operations increased. Galland demanded meetings, filed reports, and made the case with every argument at his disposal that Germany needed a different approach. The one that he returned to most insistently, the one that he believed offered the only genuine hope for reversing the tide, was the Me-262, the twin-jet Messerschmitt. Me-262 was by early 1944 the fastest aircraft in the world, capable of speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, compared to the P-51's 440. Its acceleration and climb rate were so far beyond anything the Allies possessed that in ideal circumstances a properly flown Me-262 could engage an enemy formation on its own terms, make a firing pass, and exit before any Allied fighter could effectively respond. Galland flew a prototype in May 1943 and was so overwhelmed by the experience that he wrote an enthusiastic report calling it a quantum leap in aviation. He described it as though the angels were pushing, a characteristically poetic statement from a man who expressed himself well when he chose to. He wanted the Me-262 in production immediately, in quantities as large as the German aircraft industry could manage, assigned exclusively to fighter duties and deployed in concentrated defensive formations over Germany. If this could be done, he believed, the American bombing campaign could be blunted and perhaps defeated. What happened instead was one of the great operational disasters of the Second World War, and its primary author was Adolf Hitler himself, with Göring playing a supporting role as his usual compliant self. Hitler had also heard about the Me-262, and his first question was whether it could carry bombs. When told that, in principle, it could, with modifications, he immediately declared that the Me-262 would be deployed as a blitz bomber, a fast attack aircraft that would strike Allied targets too quickly for their defences to respond. He had convinced himself that Germany's strategic problems could be solved by a high-speed bombing aircraft, an aircraft that could attack the Allied invasion fleet, the Allied airfields, the Allied supply lines, with impunity. The Me-262 as a fighter was, in his view, a defensive weapon, and Hitler despised defensive thinking almost on principle. He wanted to attack, and the Me-262 was going to be his weapon of attack. Galland was horrified. He argued against this decision with everything he had. The Me-262's strengths were its speed and its altitude performance, qualities that suited it for intercepting high-altitude bombers, but that would be largely wasted in the low-level attack role Hitler envisioned. Fitting it with bombs would degrade those very qualities and produce an aircraft that was a mediocre bomber and no longer an outstanding fighter. More importantly, every day the Me-262 was not in service. As a fighter was a day that the American bombers were destroying German cities and factories with near impunity. Galland calculated, and he was probably right, that a few hundred Me-262s deployed as fighters before the Allied invasion of France would have fundamentally changed the air situation over the continent. But Hitler would not be moved. He had made his decision, and questioning it was not something that Hitler tolerated. Göring, predictably, supported Hitler's position and turned on those in the Luftwaffe who continued to press the fighter argument, including Galland. The spring and early summer of 1944 brought the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th, and with it, the final proof that Germany's air strategy had failed. On D-Day and in the days that followed, the Luftwaffe was almost completely absent from the skies over the beachhead. Fighter Command and the American fighter forces had achieved the kind of air superiority that ensured the Allied ground forces could land and consolidate without serious interference from the air. This was not primarily because German pilots were cowardly or incompetent. It was because there were not enough of them in not enough good enough aircraft deployed in the wrong places, following the wrong strategic priorities, commanded by men who had made one wrong decision after another for the past 4 years. Galland, surveying the disaster, could have been forgiven for feeling a certain grim vindication, but he was too absorbed in the practical crisis of trying to get the Luftwaffe's fighter arm to function at all to spend much time thinking about what might have been. The situation on the Western Front deteriorated with terrible speed through the summer of 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy in late July, the liberation of Paris in August, the rapid advance toward the German border made it clear to everyone with eyes to see that the war was being lost. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, had shattered Army Group Center in what was probably the greatest single military defeat in German history, a catastrophe that dwarfed even Stalingrad in terms of the forces involved. Germany was being pressed from both sides simultaneously, and the Luftwaffe's fighter force, depleted, exhausted, and increasingly outclassed, was being asked to defend a collapsing empire with resources that were wholly inadequate to the task. It was in this context that Galland did something that required either extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation, or perhaps both in equal measure. Throughout the autumn of 1944, he began organizing the senior commanders of the German fighter arm into something that had no precise precedent in any modern military organization. He called meetings, first informal and then increasingly formal, at which the fighter wing commanders gathered to discuss not just operational matters but the fundamental failures of leadership that had brought the Luftwaffe's fighter force to its current state. These meetings were in Essence a series of organized complaints, a collective protest by Germany's most senior and experienced fighter pilots against the decisions of Hermann Göring. Galland led them. He drafted memoranda and position papers. He coordinated approaches to senior officials in the Air Ministry and even, through intermediaries, sought to communicate with Hitler himself. He was trying to go over Göring's head, and in the Third Reich, attempting to go over the head of one of the most powerful men in the country was not a career-enhancing strategy. What made this even more remarkable was that the men involved were not obscure bureaucrats with paper complaints. They were some of the most celebrated warriors in Germany, men whose names were known to every schoolchild, whose exploits filled the propaganda newsreels, who wore more military decorations between them than some entire divisions of the infantry. Men like Johannes Steinhoff, who had scored over 150 kills and who was one of the most thoughtful tactical minds in the Luftwaffe. Men like Günther Lützow, who had scored over 100 kills and who shared Galland's conviction that the senior leadership was destroying the fighter arm through incompetence. Men like Walter Krupinski, known as Graf Punsky, who had scored over 190 kills on the Eastern Front and who brought his own forthright opinions to the table with considerable force. These men, and others like them, were the living elite of German military aviation, and they were telling their superiors through Galland's organised effort that the High Command had been wrong and was continuing to be wrong in ways that were costing Germany the war. Göring's reaction when he finally received a consolidated account of what Galland had been organising was explosive. In January 1945, he summoned Galland and several of the other ringleaders to a conference that turned into something between a disciplinary hearing and a screaming match. Göring accused Galland of mutiny. He accused him of undermining discipline and morale. He accused him of disloyalty to the Reich, a charge that in Nazi Germany carried potentially fatal implications. He stripped Galland of his position as general of the fighter arm on the spot. The episode would later be nicknamed by German aviators the Mutiny of the Aces, or in German, the Mutiny of the Fighter Pilots. And it represented the most public and organised challenge to Göring's authority that any group of German officers mounted during the entire war. Had it occurred earlier in the conflict, when the regime's grip on its military was more confident, it might well have resulted in courts-martial and executions. Coming in January 1945, with Germany visibly losing the war on every front, it resulted instead in something rather different and considerably more strange. Galland was not shot. He was not court-martialed. He was not even sent to a Labour battalion, which had been the fate of some German officers who displeased their superiors. Instead, he was placed under a form of house arrest while his case was decided, and during this strange interlude, he was approached by an intermediary with a proposition from Hitler himself. The Führer, it appeared, had taken a personal interest in Galland's situation, perhaps because Galland remained one of Germany's most famous public figures, and sending him to trial would have required explaining why, or perhaps because Hitler genuinely retained some admiration for the young ace whose exploits he had followed throughout the war. The proposition was this: Galland would be permitted to form and command a special fighter unit equipped with Me-2 6-2 jets, composed entirely of volunteer pilots of his own choosing, and would lead this unit in combat in the final defence of Germany. In return, the matter of the mutiny would be considered closed. It was an extraordinary offer, almost surreally so given the circumstances, and Galland accepted it. He had been dismissed, humiliated, and effectively accused of treason. But he had also, in the last act of a war he had lost long before this moment, been given command of what would become the most remarkable combat unit of the entire conflict. The strategic situation over Germany in 1943 was not merely difficult. It was, for any honest observer of the air war's mathematics, bordering on hopeless. The numbers told the story in a language that had no room for rhetorical flourish or political optimism. In the first quarter of 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was losing pilots at a rate that significantly exceeded the training pipeline's ability to replace them with men of equivalent experience. The average new pilot arriving at an operational unit had somewhere between 150 and 200 flying hours to his credit, compared to the 300 to 400 hours that had been standard for the men who fought in the Battle of Britain. This was not a small difference. In aerial combat, the gap between a pilot with 200 hours and a pilot with 400 hours is often the difference between a man who survives his first serious engagement and one who does not. Experience in the cockpit accumulates in ways that cannot be shortcut or replicated in ground training, and the knowledge that comes from having survived 100 dangerous situations is precisely the knowledge that helps a pilot survive the 101st. Galland understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent years both flying and thinking about flying. He had seen pilots killed in their first week at the front because they made the kind of mistakes that experience would have prevented, and he had seen experienced pilots who should by rights have been dead survive situations that would have killed less seasoned men through the accumulated reflexes and judgment that only genuine operational flying can develop. His arguments for maintaining training standards were therefore not abstract management theory, but specific, concrete, and based on direct observation. When he told Goring that reducing training hours was a false economy that would cost more lives in the long run than it saved in the short run, he was speaking from a position of absolute professional authority that no one in the Luftwaffe's senior leadership was better placed to challenge. And Goring, as usual, was not listening. The dynamics of Galland's relationship with Göring during this period were played out across dozens of formal conferences, informal meetings, telephone conversations, and written communications that have survived in various archives. What emerges from these records is a portrait of two fundamentally incompatible personalities forced into a professional relationship that served neither of them and damaged the organization they were supposed to be running. Goring brought to every interaction his enormous ego, his tendency to conflate his personal reputation with Germany's military performance, his addiction to grandiose promises and comfortable fictions, and his increasing reliance on the kind of bluster and intimidation that had served him well as a political operator, but that was catastrophically inadequate as a substitute for military judgment. Galland brought his equally formidable ego, his commitment to operational honesty, his impatience with anyone who prioritized appearances over results, and his increasingly unconcealed contempt for a superior whose decisions were, in his professional assessment, killing German pilots unnecessarily. One of the most revealing exchanges in their documented history came during a conference in June 1943 when Galland presented Göring with a detailed analysis of fighter pilot losses and their causes. The analysis showed clearly that a significant proportion of German pilot losses were attributable not to superior Allied tactics or equipment, but to the operational conditions that German leadership imposed on its own men, flying with inadequate fuel reserves, flying without proper formation support, flying in defensive configurations that negated the offensive strengths of the Bf-109, and flying mission profiles that maximized exposure to enemy fire without maximizing combat effectiveness. These were correctable problems. They were problems caused by decisions made at the command level, which meant they were problems Göring could fix if he chose to. Göring's response to this analysis was characteristic. He accused Galland of making excuses for inadequate aggression. He declared that the losses were acceptable, given what was being achieved. He suggested that Galland was too close to his pilots emotionally and too far from the broader strategic picture to make sound judgments. And then he dismissed the meeting without addressing a single specific point in the analysis. Galland returned to his office and wrote up another memorandum documenting his recommendations and Göring's refusal to implement them, adding it to a growing file that was essentially a written history of everything going wrong with the Luftwaffe's fighter force and why. The summer of 1943 brought an engagement that Galland would later describe as one of the most significant he witnessed during the entire war, not because of what was achieved, but because of what was demonstrated. On July 28, 1943, a large force of B-17 flying fortresses attacked Hamburg and the surrounding industrial area as part of Operation Gomorrah, a series of coordinated attacks by RAF Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces that between July 24th and August 3rd destroyed much of the city in a series of firestorms that killed an estimated 45,000 people and left close to 1 million more homeless. The Hamburg firestorms represented a new phase in the air war, one in which the sheer weight of Allied bombing was capable of producing destruction on a scale that previous military history had no framework to contain. What struck Galland about the Hamburg raids was not primarily the human catastrophe, though that was obviously devastating, but the demonstration that the Allied bombing force had reached a level of capability that was qualitatively beyond what the current German defensive posture could contain. The fighters could inflict losses, significant losses, but they could not prevent the destruction. They were using a colander to hold water. The only solution was a fundamental change in approach, whether through new technology or new strategy, and probably through both simultaneously. It was in the aftermath of Hamburg that Galland renewed his push for the Me-262 with particular urgency, recognizing that the jet represented the only technology available to Germany that could change the equation significantly enough to matter. What he did not know at this point was that the Me-262 program was already caught in a web of competing priorities and bureaucratic confusion that would delay its entry into service by more than a year beyond what the technology actually required. The aircraft was mechanically ready for production in early 1943. The engines were ready. The airframe was tested and understood. What was not ready was the organizational will to prioritize it above everything else, to strip resources from other programs and concentrate them on getting the jet into squadron service. This failure of organizational priority was ultimately Hitler's responsibility, since it was Hitler who set the framework of national priorities within which the aircraft industry worked, but it was also the responsibility of the various Air Ministry officials who failed to present the Me-262's potential with sufficient force and clarity to cut through the competing demands on Hitler's attention. Galland's own encounter with the aircraft when he finally flew the Me-262 prototype in May 1943 is worth dwelling on because it captures something essential about what the aircraft meant and what was lost by not deploying it earlier. He had been taken to the Messerschmitt works at Augsburg and introduced to the aircraft by the design team, who walked him through its characteristics and limitations with the mixture of pride and anxiety that engineers feel when presenting their creation to a pilot who will tell them exactly what they did wrong. Galland listened to the briefing, asked several sharp questions about the engine's behavior at different throttle settings and the aircraft's characteristics near its stall speed, and then climbed into the cockpit. The start sequence for the jet engines was different from anything he had done before, the process of spooling up a turbine rather than swinging a propeller, and the sound was different too, a rising whine that built into a roar that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. And then the aircraft was moving, accelerating down the runway with a smoothness and force that was nothing like the kick of a piston engine, and Galland was airborne, and nothing was the same. He flew for 45 minutes, exploring the aircraft's envelope with the methodical precision of a man who had been doing exactly this with unfamiliar aircraft for 15 years. He checked the handling at high speed and low speed. He explored the engine's response to aggressive throttle movements and confirmed his briefing's warning that it needed to be treated gently. He tested the aircraft's rate of roll and its turning circle and its climb rate and its behavior at altitude. And when he landed and was helped out of the cockpit by the waiting engineers, his face wearing an expression they had not seen before, he said something that has been quoted in every account of the Me-262 ever written. He said it felt as though the angels were pushing. He said it was a completely new world of flying. And he said, with an urgency that was uncharacteristic of a man who prided himself on measured professional judgment, that Germany needed this aircraft in service now, not in 6 months and not next year, but now, and that everything else was secondary to making that happen. The report he wrote about the flight was one of the most enthusiastic professional assessments he ever produced, stripped of the careful hedging that normally characterized his official communications. He argued that the Me-262, deployed in fighter configuration in adequate numbers, could change the outcome of the air war over Germany. He argued that it should receive absolute priority over every other aviation development program. He argued that production should begin immediately, and that the men who understood its capabilities should be given authority to develop its tactical employment without interference from people who had not yet flown it. The report went up the chain of command and eventually reached Hitler, who read it and asked his now famous question about bombs. And everything that followed was the consequence of that question and of the answer that Göring, who should have defended the fighter program, gave to it. The individuals who worked most directly with the Me-262 program during these crucial months provide an illuminating counterpoint to the command-level failures. General Wolfram von Richthofen, a nephew of the Red Baron himself, had been arguing for jet fighter development with considerable energy within the technical side of the Air Ministry. Major Wolfgang Spetter, one of the Luftwaffe's leading fighter pilots and a man whose technical judgment Galland respected greatly, had been involved in early Me-262 testing and had produced assessments that aligned closely with Galland's own. Engineer Heinrich Beauvais at the Messerschmitt Company had worked on the aircraft's aerodynamics and could demonstrate mathematically exactly what it could achieve against American bomber formations. All of these people were saying the same thing. Deploy the Me-262 as a fighter. Deploy it now. Deploy it in numbers. All of them were ignored, overruled, or simply not heard by the people who had the authority to make the decision and who were focused on other things. The autumn of 1943 brought a crisis that sharpened everything. The American missions against Schweinfurt, the city in central Germany that contained the ball-bearing factories that produced the precision components on which the entire German war machine depended, produced the most intense aerial battles the European theatre had yet seen. The first Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, sent a force of 376 B-17S deep into Germany without fighter escort and brought back catastrophic losses. 36 bombers were lost, with 360 American airmen killed or captured. The attacking Luftwaffe fighters had found that concentrated attacks from the front of the bomber formations, approaching head-on at combined closing speeds of over 700 miles per hour, were devastating in effect. Since the bombers' frontal gun coverage was the weakest, German pilots developed specialized tactics for these frontal attacks, and the results were alarming for the Americans. But the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th was even worse. 60 B-17 shot down, 17 more written off, and nearly 600 American airmen killed or captured. It seemed for a moment that the daylight bombing campaign might be defeated after all. Galland knew better than to celebrate. He looked at those numbers with the same analytical eye he brought to everything and saw not victory but a narrow window that was already closing. The Americans would not continue sending bombers to be slaughtered without solving the escort problem, and they had the resources to solve it once they identified it clearly. The P-51 Mustang, which would be the solution, was already in existence and already being fitted with the additional fuel capacity that would give it the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. It would be available in meaningful numbers within a few months, and when it arrived, the equation would reverse and the advantage would swing decisively and permanently to the Americans. Galland communicated this assessment to his superiors in the bluntest possible terms. He told them that Schweinfurt was not a turning point. He told them that the window of defensive advantage was small and closing. He told them that the Me-262 was the only answer and that every day without it brought Germany closer to a point of no return in the air war. He was right, and he was ignored. The social world in which Galland moved during his years as general of the fighter arm was itself a fascinating microcosm of the contradictions within the Nazi military establishment. He spent time in Berlin at the various gatherings and functions that the regime used to maintain morale among its military elite, occasions where senior commanders mixed with Nazi party officials, industrialists, artists, and the various other groups that orbited the court of the Third Reich. He was a famous figure at these events, sought out by people who wanted to be photographed with Germany's most decorated pilot, and he navigated this world with the same combination of genuine charm and private detachment that characterized his public persona throughout the war. He accepted the social obligations of his position because refusing them would have been politically complicated. But he was careful about what he said and to whom, particularly as the war turned against Germany and the atmosphere in these gatherings shifted from triumphalism to anxiety to something that occasionally resembled barely suppressed panic. His personal life during these years was complex in ways he was characteristically reluctant to discuss in his public accounts. He had relationships with women but did not marry during the war years, and the few glimpses that appear in contemporary accounts suggest a man who kept his emotional life carefully separate from his professional existence, perhaps recognizing that the two were incompatible in a war that claimed the people one cared about with such depressing regularity. Friends were killed, colleagues burned in their cockpits, men he had trained with and flown with and argued with disappeared from the world with the casual finality that combat produces, and the accumulated weight of these losses was something that any man in his position carried whether he chose to discuss it or not. The photographs of Galland from the Middle War years show a man who looks older than his chronological age. Not dramatically so, but noticeably. The lines around his eyes deepening and his expression in unguarded moments carrying something that his official portraits were carefully designed to conceal. He also carried the specific psychological weight of command, the knowledge that the decisions he made and the recommendations he gave or failed to give would determine whether the men, under his authority, lived or died. Every conference where he argued for better training standards, every memorandum demanding adequate aircraft and proper tactical doctrine, every argument with Göring about the Me-262 or the disposition of fighter forces was ultimately an argument about whether specific human beings would survive specific days. He felt this responsibility deeply, and it was this feeling more than anything else that drove the increasing urgency and occasionally anger of his communications with his superiors through 1943 and into 1944. He was watching men die unnecessarily, and he was unable to stop it, and this was not a situation that a man of his temperament could accept with equanimity. The fighter commanders who gathered around Galland in the months leading up to what would become the mutiny of the Aces shared this frustration in varying degrees and with varying styles of expression. Johannes Steinhoff was perhaps the most intellectually rigorous of them, a man with a university education and a capacity for systematic analysis that complemented Galland's more intuitive approach. Steinhoff had served on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean before ending up in the fighter defense of the Reich, and his broad operational experience gave him a perspective on Luftwaffe failures that was both wide and deep. He and Galland had been corresponding informally about the problems of the fighter arm for months before the formal organisation of the protest movement began, and Steinhoff's contributions to the analysis of what was going wrong were significant. Günther Lützow, commanding JG-3, brought his own Eastern Front experience and a personal connection to several of the most serious tactical failures of the preceding years. He was a steady, serious man, less given to drama than some of the others, and his participation in the protest movement signalled to anyone who might doubt its seriousness that the complaints were coming from professional soldiers with professional grievances, not from prima donnas nursing personal resentments. Walter Krupinski was a different personality entirely. A man whose social style was considerably more boisterous than Steinhoff's or Lutzow's, and whose enormous kill score on the Eastern Front had been accumulated through a combination of ferocious aggression and physical courage that bordered on the reckless. He was also one of the most politically outspoken of the group, less inclined than Galland to couch his criticisms in the careful language of professional assessment, and more willing to state plainly what he thought about Göring's leadership in terms that left nothing to interpretation. His presence in the group was a reminder that the protest extended beyond the more measured voices and represented a genuine groundswell of opinion among the fighter arm's most experienced officers. Hans Heinrich Klose, Erich Hohagen, and several other wing commanders added their voices to the chorus, and by November and December of 1944, the organising that Galland was doing had taken on a scope and coordination that was impossible to conceal from the Air Ministry's political monitoring apparatus. The specific sequence of events that produced the climactic January 1945 confrontation with Göring is worth reconstructing in detail because it captures the essentially tragic absurdity of the situation. Galland had been aware for several weeks that his activities were known to Göring's staff and that the reaction, when it came, would be severe. He had nevertheless continued organising and corresponding because he had made a calculation, probably correct, that the only alternative to speaking up was to watch the fighter arm destroyed by incompetent command decisions while maintaining a complicit silence. This was not a choice he was capable of making. So he continued, and the confrontation was arranged, and Göring summoned the relevant commanders to a meeting that all of them knew would not go well. The meeting took place at Gatow Airfield near Berlin in January 1945, and the accounts that survive from the participants paint a vivid picture of a military organisation in the final stages of institutional breakdown. Göring arrived in his characteristic theatrical style, wearing one of his elaborate uniforms, looking ill and aged compared to the vigorous figure of 1940, clearly under enormous psychological strain from the war's demands and from Hitler's increasingly unrealistic expectations. He confronted Galland and the other assembled commanders with the evidence of their organising activities, and immediately characterised it in the most serious possible terms. He used the word mutiny. He talked about court-martial and execution. He made specific threats that were not entirely empty given the political context of January 1945, when the regime's grip on its own military was becoming desperate and arbitrary violence against perceived internal enemies was increasing. the accused pilots defended themselves. Galland argued that everything they had done was within the bounds of legitimate professional activity, that filing reports and holding discussions about operational problems was not mutiny, but duty. The argument went in circles for hours. Göring's rage exhausted itself against the wall of Galland's calm professional stubbornness, and in the end, the outcome was what the circumstances required, rather than what Göring's anger demanded. Galland was fired. The others received various forms of reassignment and reprimand, but nobody was shot, nobody was court-martialed, and the machinery of the Third Reich, which had already committed more murders than anyone could count, didn't add the names of Germany's most decorated pilots to its list of victims in the war's final months. The aftermath of the confrontation was strange and somehow characteristic of the times. Germany in January 1945 was a country simultaneously conducting a desperate military defense on multiple fronts and continuing to murder people in industrial death camps, a combination of activities that tells you everything important about what the Nazi state actually was. Within this context, the specific bureaucratic drama of Galland's removal from command was a very small thing, significant primarily to the people involved and to future historians. For Galland himself, the removal was followed almost immediately by the remarkable offer of JV-44, and the transition from disgraced commander to pilot of the world's most advanced combat aircraft happened with a speed that would have been disorienting in any circumstances and that in the context of collapsing Germany felt genuinely surreal. He spent his brief period of unofficial house arrest preparing lists of pilots he wanted for JV-44, thinking through the tactical problems of operating a jet fighter unit in the current operational environment, and corresponding with the technical staff at Messerschmitt about the aircraft's characteristics and the best methods for the interceptions he was planning. Even in disgrace, essentially confined to quarters while his professional fate was being decided above his head, he was doing what he always did, thinking about how to fight better. It was not a conscious pose or an attempt to demonstrate his loyalty. It was simply who he was. The war continued, the bombers continued to cross Germany, and someone was going to have to do something about them. And the only productive use of his time and intelligence was to work on how that could best be done. The JV-44 chapter is worth examining in additional depth because it represents a kind of concentrated essence of everything that was remarkable about Galland and about the world he inhabited. The unit was formed at Brandenburg-Brest Airfield in February 1945, with an initial allocation of perhaps 16 Me-262s, a number that fluctuated as aircraft were lost in accidents and combat and replaced from the dwindling production stream. The pilots who joined were a self-selected group of extraordinary men who had requested the posting specifically because they wanted to fly the jet, and because they wanted to serve under Galland, whose reputation for looking after his pilots was known throughout the Luftwaffe. Some of them were also motivated by the simple desire to fly the most advanced aircraft in the world before the war ended, and all of it was gone, a motivation that was honest if somewhat esoteric given the circumstances. The tactical problem that JV-44 faced was essentially this. How do you use a small number of aircraft, even very fast ones, to intercept and damage American bomber formations that might consist of several hundred aircraft spread over a large volume of sky and escorted by hundreds of fighters? The Me-262's speed advantage over the escort fighters was significant, but not unlimited, and the Americans had already worked out the counters, including the airfield ambush tactic that was costing the jets heavily. Galland's approach was to work with what the aircraft could actually do, rather than with what it theoretically should have been able to do. He recognized that the Me-262's primary strength was the speed that allowed it to make a single devastating pass through a bomber formation and exit before the escort could effectively react, and he focused his tactical development on maximizing the damage done in that brief moment of opportunity. The primary weapon the Me-262 carried for attacking bombers was the R-4M unguided air-to-air rocket, a relatively simple weapon but one that could be ripple-fired in large salvos from the aircraft's wing rails, producing a pattern of explosions through a bomber formation that could damage or destroy multiple aircraft simultaneously. A single Me-262 carrying 24 of these rockets, firing them in 2 or 3 ripple bursts during a head-on attack on a bomber formation at closing speed, could inflict damage on a scale that was wholly disproportionate to the aircraft's number and that no defensive gunner could effectively counter because of the sheer speed of the approach. In practice, the conditions required for this kind of attack to work perfectly were rarely all present simultaneously, but on the occasions when everything came together, the results were dramatic. JV-44's kill-to-loss ratio in its brief combat career was respectable, though the overall strategic impact of the unit's activities was obviously negligible given the scale of the Allied air effort. What JV-44 represents in historical terms is not a military contribution to the outcome of the war, which it could not have influenced even if everything had gone perfectly. It represents something else, the last gasp of individual excellence in an age that was already transitioning to a kind of industrial warfare where individual excellence mattered less and less. The men of JV-44 were among the finest military aviators the world had produced, flying the most technically advanced aircraft of the era, and they were completely unable to change anything about the outcome of a war that had been decided by production lines and logistics and the weight of industrial civilization brought to bear on a specific military objective. There is something genuinely moving about this, even in a conflict that produced more than enough genuine tragedy to fill any amount of historical reflection. Galland's wounding on April 26th came during one of the unit's most intense combat periods. By this point, JV-44 had relocated to Munich-Riem to be closer to the American bomber routes over southern Germany, and the operational tempo was punishing for both men and machines. Aircraft serviceability was declining as spare parts became harder to obtain. Pilots were exhausted from the continuous operations, and the ground situation was deteriorating so rapidly that the unit was occasionally within earshot of artillery fire. From the advancing Allied armies, Galland's knee wound on that April day was serious but not life-threatening, and the Me-262 he brought back to Munich-Riem with a damaged engine and a damaged pilot was repaired faster than its pilot was. He was in the hospital when JV-44 flew its last missions, when the airfield at Munich-Riem was overrun by Allied forces, and when the war ended. He heard the news of Germany's surrender from a hospital bed, surrounded by the sounds of a country trying to come to terms with what had been done in its name. The Allied officers who arrived to interview him found a man who was already thinking about what came next, not in a selfish or calculating way, but in the way that active minds inevitably do when the immediate crisis has passed. He answered their questions about the Me-262 in detail that they found extremely valuable, since the Americans and British were both intensely interested in jet aviation, and the German program was ahead of anything the Allies had developed operationally. His knowledge of the aircraft's handling characteristics, its tactical employment, and its technical limitations was exactly what the Allied aviation establishments needed to accelerate their own jet programs, and he provided it without reservation, perhaps because he could see that the information served no German military purpose any longer and considerable scientific value to people who would now be building the future of aviation. The Cold War that was already beginning to take shape would make jet fighters very important very quickly, and the foundations laid in Germany during the war would underpin much of what came after. His later life in Argentina provided him with something valuable: distance. He was far enough from Germany and from the immediate post-war reckoning to think with some clarity about what had happened, and to write about it without the pressure of being constantly surrounded by the political and social consequences of the defeat. Die Ersten und die Letzten, his memoir, benefited from this distance, and it is genuinely one of the finest books written by any participant in the air war on any side, distinguished not just by the vividness of its combat accounts, but by the honesty of its institutional criticism. Galland named names. He described meetings as they actually happened. He did not protect Göring or the Air Ministry officials whose decisions he had opposed, and he did not pretend that Germany's defeat was primarily the result of superior Allied numbers rather than the failure of German leadership. This honesty gave the book a credibility that more self-serving accounts lacked, and has made it a standard reference for historians working on the Luftwaffe ever since. The Argentine years also gave him time to consider the moral dimensions of his service in ways that the wartime pressure of immediate events had not permitted. He did not emerge from this reflection with the kind of dramatic conversion or public confession that some former German officers attempted, and he was too honest to manufacture guilt he did not feel or to disavow actions he continued to believe were professionally defensible. What he did conclude, and what he said in various interviews and public statements over the following decades, was that the German military's collective failure to resist the criminality of the Nazi regime was a genuine moral failure, a failure of institution and of individual conscience, and that the professional culture of military obedience that had made it easy to follow orders without questioning what those orders served was something that needed to be fundamentally reconsidered in the building of a new German military identity. This was not a dramatic statement. It was a quiet and carefully qualified conclusion that reflected the same honest intelligence he had brought to everything else in his life, and it was probably more genuinely useful to the process of building a democratic German defense force than more theatrical expressions of contrition would have been. His role as informal consultant to the early Bundesluftwaffe was largely behind the scenes but not without significance. The men who were building the new German Air Force faced the specific challenge of creating a military institution that was both genuinely effective and genuinely democratic, that could attract and retain talented officers without reproducing the cultural pathologies of the old Wehrmacht, and that could work as a genuine partner within the NATO alliance, rather than as a national military force pursuing national objectives. Galland's advice in this context was practical and grounded in his own experience of what went wrong when military culture prized obedience over judgment and loyalty to superiors over loyalty to professional and ethical standards. He told the younger officers who sought his counsel that the single most important thing they could take from the Luftwaffe's experience was the lesson that Göring's story embodied, that a military organization whose senior leaders cannot be effectively challenged when they are wrong is a military organization that will destroy itself and those who serve in it. This was good advice, and the Bundesluftwaffe that eventually emerged was demonstrably different in organizational culture from the Wehrmacht it replaced. Whether Galland's counsel contributed to that difference, or whether other factors were more important, is impossible to determine with precision. But the fact that he gave the counsel and that it was sensible counsel is part of the historical record. In his very last years, as he moved through his 70s and into his 80s, Galland became a kind of living monument, the last major surviving figure of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, sought out by historians and aviation enthusiasts and documentary filmmakers from around the world. He was always available for serious inquiries and always thoughtful in his responses. He attended reunions with former opponents that were remarkable for their warmth and mutual respect. He signed photographs and books for the enthusiasts who formed the ever-growing community of Second World War aviation history. He wore his years well, maintaining the erect military bearing of a man who had spent his adult life in the cockpit, and the cigar remained an anchor of continuity connecting the old man to the young ace, whose story was what everyone came to hear. He died in Bonn on February 9, 1996, 2 weeks before his 84th birthday. The obituaries that appeared in Germany, Britain and America all emphasized the same things: the extraordinary combat record, the iconic status, the unusual integrity that had made him willing to challenge Goring at personal risk. The former opponents who paid tribute included veterans of the RAF and the USAAF, who spoke of him with genuine admiration. The German aviation community mourned one of its last great figures. And the historical record that he had spent his post-war life helping to create remained a detailed and honest account of the Air War's most consequential chapter, written by a man who had been in the middle of all of it, from beginning to end. Jagdverband 44, or JV-44 as it was universally known, was unlike any other military unit that has ever existed. It was formed in February 1945, in the last desperate weeks of the Third Reich, equipped with the world's most advanced fighter aircraft and manned by a collection of the most experienced and decorated combat pilots in aviation history. Galland set about building it with the same intense focus he brought to everything, personally selecting his pilots from the volunteers who came forward, choosing men he knew and trusted, men who had proven themselves in hundreds of combat missions, men who wore the Knight's Cross and its upgrades as matter-of-factly as most soldiers wore their uniform insignia. The unit's nicknames told the story better than any official description. It was called the Squadron of Experts. It was called the Squadron of Aces. It was called with a certain dark humour that only men in an utterly impossible situation could sustain, the Squadron of the Lost. All of these names were accurate, and none of them captured the full strangeness of what JV-44 actually was. The aircraft they flew, the Me-262, remained the most revolutionary combat aircraft of the entire war. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines produced a thrust and speed that was simply unavailable to any piston engine aircraft, no matter how well designed or powerful. In level flight, the Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter by a comfortable margin, and its climb rate and ceiling gave it options in a combat situation that no propeller-driven opponent could match. But the aircraft also had genuine and serious problems that made flying it in combat a significantly more dangerous proposition than the performance figures suggested. The jet engines were temperamental and prone to flame out, particularly during aggressive throttle movements that were a natural instinct for fighter pilots trained on piston engines. The engines also had an operational life of only about 25 hours before requiring complete overhaul, a logistical nightmare that placed constant demands on the already strained maintenance facilities. The aircraft was difficult to handle at low speed, making takeoff and landing particularly dangerous, and it was during these phases of flight that the Messerschmitt was most vulnerable to Allied fighter attack. The Americans had quickly learned that the best way to neutralize the Me-262 was not to chase it in the air, where it could not be caught, but to wait near its airfields and attack the jets during their vulnerable approach and landing phases, when their speed was low and their ability to maneuver was limited. Many of the JV-44 pilots who survived the Me-262's technical challenges were killed in this way, ambushed at minimum speed over their own airfields by P-51s that had been lurking at altitude, waiting for exactly this opportunity. Galland took all of these challenges and dealt with them in his characteristic way, which was to gather the best information available, make the best plan that information supported, brief his pilots thoroughly, and then lead from the front. He flew his first combat mission with JV-44 in early March 1945, and the experience of taking a jet fighter into combat against American bomber formations was something he later described as both exhilarating and profoundly melancholy. Exhilarating because the aircraft's performance was genuinely staggering, because the sensation of approaching a bomber formation at 500 miles per hour and watching the gunners in their turrets trying desperately to track a target moving faster than anything they had ever encountered was unlike anything he had experienced in 6 years of aerial combat. And melancholy because he could see clearly that even this extraordinary aircraft, arriving far too late and in numbers far too small to make a strategic difference, could not change the outcome of a war that had already been decided. JV-44 flew its combat operations from Munich-Riem airfield in Bavaria, and from there engaged American bomber formations attacking targets in southern Germany. The unit had perhaps 30 to 40 operational Me-262s at any given time, depending on serviceability and combat losses, and rarely put more than 20 aircraft into the air for a single mission. Against formations of hundreds of B-17 and B-24, escorted by hundreds of P-51, even 20 Me-262 could do significant damage if everything went right. But the logistics of getting 20 jets airborne, assembled and pointed at a formation before being intercepted by the Allied escort was a task of considerable complexity. Nevertheless, JV-44 achieved results that were impressive given the circumstances, shooting down a number of bombers in each major engagement and demonstrating clearly what a properly equipped and deployed jet fighter force could have done if it had been available a year or two earlier. The pilots of JV-44 were a genuinely remarkable collection of individuals, and their stories deserve to be told in some detail because they represent the human face of what might otherwise seem like a purely technological or strategic story. Johannes Steinhoff, who had been one of the key figures in the mutiny of the Aces alongside Galland, flew with JV-44 and was severely burned in a takeoff accident when his Me-262 crashed and caught fire on the runway at Munich-Riem in April 1945. He survived, though with terrible injuries that required dozens of reconstructive surgeries over the following years, and would later play a significant role in rebuilding the West German Air Force. Günther Lützow, another veteran of the mutiny and one of the most respected commanders in the Luftwaffe, served briefly with JV-44 before being seriously wounded. Walter Krupinski, the Eastern Front ace with nearly 200 victories, was also among the unit's members. Eduard Neumann, who had been Galland's predecessor in several important command positions and who was one of the most thoughtful officers in the fighter arm, contributed his experience. These men were the living library of German fighter aviation, and Galland had assembled them in one place in one of the most extraordinary final acts of a war full of extraordinary moments. The personal dynamics within JV-44 were complex in ways that reflected the larger stresses of fighting for a regime that most of its members had long since stopped believing in, while still feeling bound by duty, loyalty to their comrades, and professional pride to continue fighting. Most of the men in JV-44 were not Nazis in any meaningful ideological sense. They were career, military officers and professional pilots who had grown up in one Germany, been trained in another, fought in a third, and were now watching a fourth crumble around them. They held the Nazi leadership in varying degrees of contempt, ranging from Galland's privately expressed frustration with Göring's incompetence to more radical views that were held but rarely spoken. Several of the men had personal connections to the resistance against Hitler, carefully concealed, and at least one had tangential knowledge of the July 1944 assassination attempt. None of this prevented them from flying their jets and fighting the Americans, because doing otherwise would have meant abandoning the other men in their unit to certain death, and that was simply not something any of them were capable of. Galland himself was shot down on April 26, 1945, in one of the last significant aerial engagements the unit would fight. He was attacking a formation of B-26 Marauder medium bombers when he was hit by return fire and also, apparently, bounced by a P-47 Thunderbolt that caught him from behind during the attack run. The Me-262 took multiple hits, the cockpit was penetrated, and Galland was wounded in the knee by a shell fragment that embedded itself with enough force to cause immediate and severe pain. He managed to control the damaged jet through the pain and fear of what might be a catastrophic structural failure, nursing it back toward Munich-Riem with one working engine and a cockpit full of smoke, and landed heavily, but in one piece, on the damaged runway. The knee wound was serious enough that it required immediate surgery, and Galland spent the last days of the war in a hospital bed in Bavaria, immobilized, as Germany collapsed completely around him. The end came quickly. Hitler committed suicide in the ruins of Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had been named Hitler's successor, began negotiating the terms of Germany's unconditional surrender. The fighting ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, a date that went into history as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, celebrated throughout the Allied world with an intensity of relief and joy that can barely be imagined by those who did not live through the years that preceded it. In Germany itself, the reaction was more complicated. For most Germans, it was simply the end, the conclusion of a catastrophe that had destroyed their country and killed millions of people, and the predominant emotion was exhaustion rather than anything else. For Galland, lying in his hospital bed in Bavaria when the war ended, the immediate practical concern was what would happen to him next. He was a wounded general of an air force that had just ceased to exist in a country that was now divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the former Allied powers. The Americans who had been fighting to kill him just days earlier now arrived at his hospital bed in a somewhat different capacity, as intelligence officers, who wanted to talk to him. The Allied forces were understandably extremely interested in everything the senior German commanders could tell them about the weapons, tactics, technologies, and decision-making processes that had characterized the German war effort. And Galland, as a man who had been at the center of Luftwaffe operations for the entire war and who had extensive knowledge of the Me-262 program, was a particularly valuable source of information. He cooperated with his captors to a degree that was both pragmatic and carefully calculated. He had no particular reason to protect Nazi Germany's secrets since Nazi Germany no longer existed, and he had every reason to make himself useful enough to the Americans that his own situation would be handled as comfortably as possible. He gave extensive debriefings about Luftwaffe operations, about the Me-262, about the organizational failures that had hampered the German fighter arm, about his views on the relative quality of Allied and German aircraft, and about the technical details of German jet engine development. These debriefings were thorough and professional, and Galland handled them with the same direct intelligence he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He was honest about German failures, including his own, and he was honest about what he considered to have been Germany's genuine strengths and innovations. The Americans found him valuable, cooperative, and personally compelling, and his status as a prisoner of war was considerably more comfortable than that of most German officers captured at the same time. The question of war crimes trials, which occupied so much of the post-war period for senior German military figures, was never a serious issue for Galland in the way it was for many of his contemporaries. Unlike generals who had commanded ground forces involved in mass killings of civilians or prisoners, unlike air commanders who had ordered terror bombing of undefended population centres, Galland had spent the war in a role that was essentially clean in operational terms. He was a fighter pilot who had fought other fighter pilots and attempted to protect German territory from bombing. He had not commanded units involved in the Holocaust. He had not ordered atrocities. He had not been involved in the administration of occupied territories. The evidence suggests that he was personally opposed to many of the crimes being committed in Germany's name, though like most senior military figures he had lacked either the courage or the opportunity to do anything concrete about them. The post-war tribunals had enough genuine war criminals to prosecute without spending time on a man whose primary offence was being good at shooting down enemy aircraft, and Galland was not among those called to account at Nuremberg or in subsequent proceedings. His transition from prisoner of war to free man came in 1947, 2 years after the war's end, when he was released from Allied captivity. He was 35 years old, in good health aside from the knee wound that had been properly treated, and faced with the task of rebuilding a life in a Germany that was occupied, divided, impoverished, and deeply shamed by what had been done in its name. This was not an easy environment in which to be a celebrated former military hero, since the entire German military experience of the Second World War was now viewed through the lens of Nazi criminality, and figures who had been celebrated during the war found the same fame that had protected them now working against them in a world that was understandably suspicious of anything that had been associated with the Third Reich. Galland handled this challenge with a pragmatism and adaptability that were characteristic of him. He did not publicly dwell on the war. He did not attempt to justify or rehabilitate the regime he had served. He was honest when asked direct questions and skillfully vague when vagueness served him better. And he began looking for opportunities. The opportunity that actually transformed his post-war life came from a direction that might seem surprising, but that in retrospect makes complete sense. Argentina, under the government of Juan Perón, was in the late 1940s engaged in a serious program of building up its own air force, and Perón's government had made the quite sensible assessment that Germany's defeat did not mean that German aviation expertise had become worthless. On the contrary, the men who had developed and flown the most advanced military aircraft of the era, who had spent years solving the practical problems of aerial combat at the highest level, were exactly the kind of consultants a developing air force needed. Argentina put out quiet feelers through various channels, and Galland, who was finding post-war Germany a somewhat claustrophobic environment, responded positively. In 1948, he travelled to Argentina and began a new chapter of his life in South America. His role in Argentina was as a consultant and instructor to the Argentine Air Force, which was in the process of equipping itself with modern jet aircraft, primarily the British de Havilland Vampire, and needed experienced jet pilots to help develop tactics and training programs. Galland threw himself into this work with his usual energy and professionalism, and his expertise was genuinely valuable. He was not the only German aviation expert who found his way to Argentina during this period. The country's combination of political receptiveness to German immigrants, geographic distance from Europe's post-war complications, and genuine need for technical expertise made it attractive to a number of former Luftwaffe personnel, some of them considerably more compromised by war crimes than Galland. His connections to this community were sometimes a source of difficulty for him in later years, since the Argentine émigré community included genuine war criminals and Nazi true believers, alongside professional military men like himself who had served the regime without being ideologically committed to it. He remained in Argentina for several years, building a life there that was comfortable, if not particularly glamorous, forming professional relationships and personal friendships, and beginning to put some distance between himself and the war. He also began working on his memoirs, drawing on his extraordinary memory and the professional diaries he had kept throughout his career to reconstruct in detail the experiences and decisions of the preceding decade. The memoirs, published in 1953 in Germany under the title Die Ersten und die Letzten, which translates roughly as the first and the last, referring to the first and last engagements of the air war, were an immediate sensation. They were honest, vivid, beautifully written and remarkably candid about the failures of German leadership, including and especially Göring's failures, while celebrating the courage and skill of the pilots who had flown under impossible conditions and achieved remarkable things. The book became an international bestseller, translated into numerous languages, and established Galland as both a historical figure of major significance and a gifted writer. His account of the Spitfire incident alone became one of the most quoted anecdotes in aviation history. The book also provided him with a degree of financial security that his post-war career up to that point had not offered, and it allowed him to return to Germany with something like a normal life ahead of him. His return to West Germany in the mid-1950s coincided with a development that would have seemed incredible in 1945, but that the Cold War had made politically necessary. West Germany was being rearmed as part of the NATO alliance, and one of the things that needed to be re-established was a German air force. The Luftwaffe, established in 1955, needed experienced officers, and the pool of experienced German military aviators necessarily included a large number of former Luftwaffe personnel. This was awkward for obvious reasons, requiring careful navigation of the line between using valuable expertise and rehabilitating men who had served a criminal regime. But the practical military necessity was real, and the West German government was determined to build an effective air force for the defense of the new republic. Galland was consulted during this process and offered advice on the structure, doctrine, and equipment of the new service, though he did not take a formal position within it. His experience and his ability to think clearly about air power made his input valuable, and the fact that he had spent the end of the war actively fighting against Göring's incompetent leadership gave him a somewhat more defensible political position than many of his former colleagues. The decades that followed were good to Adolf Galland in most respects. He became a respected and sought-after figure in aviation circles internationally, attending air shows and conferences, corresponding with former opponents including former Spitfire and Hurricane pilots who found in him a worthy adversary they could respect, and continuing to write and lecture about the air war with a clarity and candour that his peers often found inspiring and that historians found invaluable. He married 3 times, the marriages reflecting the characteristic restlessness and intensity of a man who had lived at full speed since his childhood. He maintained his love of flying well into middle age, and when jet aircraft became available to private pilots as surplus military trainers, he took every opportunity to get back into the cockpit of a jet and remember what it felt like to be the fastest thing in the sky. He was also a significant presence in the growing community of historical analysis of the Second World War, interviewed countless times by historians, filmmakers and journalists, and consistently forthcoming about the strategic and leadership failures that had determined the outcome of the air war. He never absolved himself of responsibility for participating in the German war effort, but he consistently distinguished between the professional military experience of fighting for one's country and the moral catastrophe of serving a genocidal regime, arguing that he had done the former and rejected, to the extent that his position permitted, the latter. Whether this argument fully satisfied the demands of historical accountability is a question that historians continue to debate, and Galland himself was not naive about the limitations of his own position. He had served a regime that committed crimes of unimaginable scale, and whatever the nature of his personal views, his skill and fame had contributed to the regime's prestige and its ability to sustain the war. That fact could not be entirely argued away. In his later years, Galland became something of an elder statesman of aviation, a living connection to the most intense period of aerial warfare in history, respected by pilots and historians on both sides of the conflict as a man who had genuinely embodied the highest standards of his dangerous profession. He received visits from former enemies who came to talk about the war they had shared from opposite sides, and he received them with a warmth and openness that spoke well of his character. The old fighter pilot's code, which insisted on respect for a worthy opponent regardless of the political context in which the fighting took place, was something that the men who had actually fought the air war seemed to carry more genuinely than the politicians and propagandists who had surrounded them. He lived in Remagen, Germany, and later maintained homes in Munich and on the Spanish coast, and he continued to work on aviation-related projects well into his 70s and 80s. He was a vigorous and intellectually active man even in his later decades, curious about new aircraft and new aviation technology, engaged with the historical debates about the air war, and always willing to discuss his experiences with anyone who approached him with genuine interest. He became a regular figure at wartime aviation reunions on both sides, attending events where former Spitfire pilots and former Bf-109 pilots could meet as old men and talk about what they had shared in the skies over England 50 years earlier. The cigar, of course, was always there. The enormous cigar that he had become famous for smoking in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt, a habit that had struck his contemporaries as simultaneously absurd and magnificently debonair, remained his companion through the post-war decades, a permanent prop in the photographs taken of him at air shows and historical events and informal meetings with former enemies. He smoked them with the same unself-conscious pleasure that he had always brought to the good things in life, and their presence in photographs of the old general chatting with former RAF pilots or signing copies of his memoirs gave him a kind of physical continuity with the young ace of 1940, a visible link between the man who had asked for Spitfires and the man who was now talking about it with people who had flown those Spitfires against him. There were controversies in his post-war life, as there were for virtually every senior German military figure of the era. His connections to the Argentine military community during the Perón years raised questions that were never entirely comfortable. His occasional failure to engage with sufficient directness on questions about the Holocaust and his own moral position during the war disappointed some historians who expected more from a man of his intelligence and integrity. His memoirs, brilliant as they were as a personal account of the air war, were not always equally brilliant on the broader moral landscape of the conflict, a limitation that he shared with most of the pilots and commanders who wrote about their experiences in this period. The air war had a seductive purity about it, a sense of individual courage and professional skill tested in direct competition against worthy opponents that made it easy to discuss at length without engaging equally with the larger context of what it served. But these limitations should not obscure what was genuinely admirable about the man. He had told the truth to Hermann Göring in a context where telling the truth was dangerous. He had organised a protest against incompetent and destructive leadership at a moment when doing so required more than ordinary courage in a political system that tortured and killed people for considerably lesser offences. He had fought for his pilots' welfare and their professional dignity with a consistency and intensity that earned him their genuine love, not the performed loyalty that authority can command, but the real affection that comes from knowing someone is genuinely in your corner. He had been one of the finest combat pilots of his generation, and he had used his skill and intelligence in service of the best values of his profession, even when the political system he operated within tried to prevent it. And he had, in the end, been right about almost everything that mattered. He had been right that the Battle of Britain could not be won with the tactics Göring insisted upon. He had been right that bomber losses would be catastrophic without fighter escort. He had been right that training standards needed to be maintained even at the cost of fewer pilots. He had been right that the Me-262 should have been deployed as a fighter rather than a bomber. He had been right that concentrating the fighter force for the defence of Germany offered better results than dispersing it across multiple theatres. He had been right, and being right had gotten him fired, accused of mutiny, and nearly court-martialed. That history, the history of a man whose correct professional judgments were overruled at every turn by a vain and incompetent superior acting in service of a delusional leader, was ultimately the most significant thing about Adolf Galland's war. More significant even than his 104 aerial victories, or his extraordinary personal courage. The question of what might have been if Galland's recommendations had been followed is one that aviation historians have explored with considerable interest and varying conclusions. Some argue that even a fully implemented Galland program, concentrating the fighter force and deploying the Me-262 correctly and in numbers, could only have delayed rather than prevented Germany's defeat, given the overwhelming material advantage of the Allied coalition. Others suggest that a different air strategy might have significantly extended the war by making the Allied strategic bombing campaign prohibitively expensive, with consequences that are difficult to calculate but potentially significant. What is clear is that the fighter arm's inability to implement a rational strategy because of Göring's failures as a commander and Hitler's catastrophic interference in technical military matters accelerated Germany's defeat in a measurable way and cost the lives of thousands of German pilots who might have survived with better leadership and better decisions above them. Hermann Göring, the man who had been Galland's nemesis for 5 years, met his end in the way that seemed most appropriate to his character. Captured by American forces in May 1945, he was tried at Nuremberg as one of the chief defendants in the International Military Tribunal, where the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been one of the architects of the persecution of the Jews. He had ordered the terror bombing of Warsaw. He had overseen the formation of the Gestapo. He had been one of the central figures in the planning and execution of the aggressive war that had killed tens of millions of people. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death by hanging. In a final act of theatre that was entirely in keeping with the man he had been, Goring committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule on October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, cheating the hangman in the only way still available to him and denying the Allied powers the satisfaction of an orderly execution. It was a coward's way out disguised as a gesture of defiance, which was rather the story of his entire career. Adolf Galland outlived his old enemy by 50 years, dying on February 9, 1996, in Bonn, West Germany, at the age of 83. He had lived long enough to see Germany reunited and democratic, to see the Luftwaffe become one of the most effective air forces in Europe, to see the aircraft he had flown become museum pieces lovingly restored by enthusiasts who had never experienced anything like war. He had lived long enough to be recognized by opponents as well as countrymen as one of the most significant military pilots of the 20th century, a man whose tactical intelligence, professional integrity, and personal courage had distinguished him even in the service of a cause that deserved no distinction. His funeral was attended by former opponents and former comrades alike, and the tributes paid to him crossed national lines in a way that reflected the genuine respect he had earned from men who had done their best to kill him in the skies over France and England and Germany half a century before. His story is not simple, and it does not permit simple conclusions. He was a great pilot who served a terrible regime. He was an honest man who served an organization built on lies. He was a defender of his pilots' welfare in a system that treated human beings as expendable material. He was a voice of military reason in an institution commanded by a figure of almost operatic incompetence. And he was, in the end, a man who did what he believed was right, under conditions that made doing what was right extremely difficult, which is perhaps the most we can ask of anyone who has the misfortune to live through a catastrophic time in history. The cigar, the Spitfire comment, the mutiny of the Aces, the squadron of lost pilots flying their jets in the last weeks of a dying Reich, these are the images that have attached themselves permanently to Adolf Galland's name, and they are images worth carrying forward. They remind us that even in the worst of wars, served by the worst of regimes, there were men who maintained their professional standards, their personal integrity, and their human decency, not perfectly, not without compromise, but with enough consistency to be worth remembering. And they remind us that the greatest aerial battles of the Second World War were fought not just between nations and ideologies, but between individual human beings at the extreme edges of what was technically and physically and psychologically possible, and that the men who flew in those battles, on whatever side, were doing something that required a courage and skill that commands respect, even when the cause they served does not. The sky over Western Germany on a clear winter morning in 1945 was full of the sound of jet engines. JV-44's Messerschmitts were climbing toward another interception, their pilots already scanning the horizon for the glint of American formations. Among them, in the cockpit of an aircraft that represented the most advanced thing in the sky on any side of any war being fought anywhere in the world, was a man with a cigar and a grudge, and 104 confirmed kills and a knee that ached from a shell fragment, and a smile that he wore in the cockpit the way some men wear armour. He was going toward the enemy. He had always gone toward the enemy. It was, in the end, the only thing he ever did that was entirely simple. Well, that is the story of Adolf Galland, one of the most fascinating and complicated figures. Produced by the Second World War, a man whose extraordinary talent was matched by his personal courage and whose career was defined as much by the enemies he made on his own side as by the opponents he faced across the front lines. If you enjoyed learning about Galland's remarkable journey from the gliding clubs of Westphalia to the cockpits of the world's first jet fighters, make sure to check out our other videos covering the stories of Germany's greatest military commanders and the conflicts that shaped their lives. We have videos about what became of other top German generals after the war, about the secret weapons programs that Germany pursued in the final desperate years of the Reich, about the stories of the men who challenged Hitler and Goring and paid various prices for their courage. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another video from us. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one. The legacy of Adolf Galland is inseparable from the legacy of the air war itself, a conflict that transformed military technology, reshaped the geopolitical order, and cost millions of lives in 4 years of fighting that pressed the boundaries of human courage and endurance on every side. He was among the greatest of those who fought it, not simply because of the numbers on his score sheet or the decorations around his neck, but because of the honesty and professional integrity he maintained throughout, even and especially when those qualities cost him dearly. His was a life lived at full speed from beginning to end, and his story, told in full, is one of the most remarkable that the 20th century produced.